Well, hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, I'm going to be reviewing W by Oliver Stone, and I attempted to record this a few days ago, but guess what? Nature called, and I had to heed the call, and that just disrupted my plans for the day to record the episode. So, sometimes a little silly thing can just disrupt you and just throw off your game, and I'm back at it again today. I'm going to record this episode and talk about this movie. Yes, we're looking at one of the more unusual political biopics ever released, Oliver Stone's 2008 film W. So rather than delivering some fiery political attack or a comprehensive history lesson, Oliver Stone chose to make something far more intimate this time, a character study of the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, or George W., as, he would be called in the Texan language. So this was a movie I had not seen when it was originally released, and in fact, uh, I just saw it for the first time this year. So there was a considerable distance between when this came out and when I saw it, and it maybe helped me see it through a fresh pair of eyes because at around the year 2008, I was definitely a fierce critic of George W. Bush, and even though I still am, I think this was a little more interesting to view it all these years later for the first time. So, this did come out on October 17th, 2008, while Bush was still in office. So, W arrived at a unique moment in American history. It's rare for Hollywood to produce a major biographical film about a sitting president, and in fact, I don't know if it's ever happened before this movie, but it makes the movie feel almost like history unfolding in real time or something like that. Like I said, it was directed by Oliver Stone, but also it was written by Stanley Weiser. The film runs just over 2 hours and blends biography, political drama, satire, and even some moments of comedy into a surprisingly restrained portrait. Now, when I say comedy, it's not exactly like a knee slapper of a comedy or anything like that. I don't think there are many moments where people would be rolling in the aisles. But there are a few eye rolling moments where W, is just a silly goose, you might say. And that's in addition to being a war criminal. Although, to be honest, if you watch this movie, you're probably not going to come away thinking that, oh, George W. Bush must have been a bad guy, because this movie is actually pretty soft on the president or the former president, although he was president at the time. Now, it's important to point out that W is not a documentary, nor is it intended to be a perfectly accurate historical account. Obviously, it's a movie. It's based around true events, but also includes dramatized conversations and imagined private moments to explore Bush's personality and his motivations. And Stone himself, I think he saw the film as capturing events in the moment rather than attempting to write the definitive history of the Bush presidency. So it pays to look at this movie not just from a sharply critical perspective, but also just to try to understand maybe what uh, Oliver Stone was going for here. It does have an all-star cast. One of the film's biggest strengths is its remarkable ensemble cast. Josh Brolin takes on the enormous challenge of portraying George W. Bush, while Elizabeth Banks plays First Lady Laura Bush. And I do have to say, as far as Josh Brolin goes, even though he doesn't really look that much like George W. Bush, and it took some time for me to sort of get used to his portrayal, I will say that he pretty successfully conveys George W. Bush as a character, and it's it's one of the strengths of the movie. Now, James Cromwell plays George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr. And I gotta say, this is gonna sound very harshly critical of Cromwell, but I, I found it a little bit disconcerting, his portrayal, because Josh Brolin actually does pretty successfully uh, seem like George W. Bush at times, whereas James Cromwell doesn't seem at all like George Bush Sr. So that just kind of threw me off. And I hate to say it, but I think he gave one of the weakest performances in the movie for that reason, because, you know, George H.W. Bush, you could say what you want about the man, but he definitely has a recognizable voice and a recognizable speaking style and all of that kind of stuff. And James Cromwell just doesn't seem like George Bush Sr. To her credit, Ellen Burstyn does a pretty solid job as Barbara Bush, although she really doesn't have that much screen time. But you know, she's good in practically everything she does. So you know, I don't think I need to say a whole lot about her performance. But you know, it is an attempt to give the audience a glimpse into the family dynamics that shaped Bush's life and presumably some of his thinking. So the administration is equally well represented, with Richard Dreyfuss as Dick Cheney, and he does a pretty good job as Cheney. And you've got Jeffrey Wright as Colin Powell, Tandiwe Newton as Condoleezza Rice, Scott Glenn as Donald Rumsfeld, and Toby Jones as Karl Rove. So you might recognize Scott Glenn from The Silence of the Lambs. Um, I personally am not that familiar with, you know, Jeffrey Wright or Tandiwe Newton, or for that matter, Toby Jones. But you know, I probably have seen them in other roles, and the performances are often they're, they're not. I wouldn't say they're particularly entertaining, but you know, it's something to see these characters portrayed. You know, in a movie, it's definitely interesting. And you know, some people have said that several cabinet members come across as mere caricatures rather than fully developed characters, and I can kind of understand that critique, but at the same time you got to keep in mind that this movie is offering us some snapshots, if you will, of moments in the administration. And the story, I think it's actually a decent story here. The narrative alternates between two timelines. One follows Bush's younger years, presenting him as an aimless young man struggling to earn the approval of his father. So, you know, President George H.W. Bush is kind of the stern father who sees his son as an undisciplined wreck. And the film suggests that this desire for acceptance became one of the defining motivations of George W. Bush's life. And I think I've heard some news reports suggesting that as well. I don't know how much credence to give that, but it's a it's an aspect of George W. Bush's life that actually is interesting. Along the way, we see many of the major turning points that helped shape Bush's journey: his struggles with alcohol and eventual sobriety, his religious conversion, which ended up kind of damaging the country, in my view, at least in some ways, his ownership of the Texas Rangers baseball team, which personally I wish he would have just stayed doing stuff like that, and his successful campaign for governor of Texas, and ultimately the controversial 2000 presidential election, and of course the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq. And, you know, that's one of the things that the movie highlights is these internal debates that were leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And those scenes focus heavily on cabinet meetings, discussing intelligence reports, weapons of mass destruction, and the arguments for military action. And rather than portraying these moments as simple good versus evil decisions, Stone emphasizes the competing personalities, the differing viewpoints, and tensions inside the administration. Now, I don't know how accurate these scenes are, but you got to keep in mind it is just a movie, and that they might have taken some liberty with these meetings and various themes in the storyline. So, if you're expecting another Oliver Stone political thriller, W may surprise you. It's actually not that uh, much of a thriller, or it's not really particularly critical of the president at the time. Compared to those earlier films, W is considered remarkably restrained, and personally, I think that's possibly a weakness of the movie. But I also understand why he probably made this decision. He was dealing with years and years of criticism of uh, chasing controversy. So I think he's like, you know what? I'm gonna finally make a movie that is less controversial. Although oddly enough, it actually became more controversial because it was intended to be non-controversial. He didn't actually uh, harshly criticize George W. Bush in this film. Instead of portraying Bush as either a hero or a villain, Stone focuses on several of those recurring themes. And one is Bush's lifelong desire to earn his father's approval. And throughout the film, George H.W. Bush looms over nearly every major decision, whether directly or indirectly. Another is, yes, the faith stuff as a source of personal transformation. Bush's religious conversion and his sobriety are presented as sincere turning points that fundamentally changed his life. Now, I don't know to what extent that was actually true. I'm a little bit more cynical than some people are because I think it's largely a sort of PR thing. You have to keep in mind that he was uh, catering to a religious base in order to get elected. And certainly his life probably did have a heavy religious contingent to it. But at the same time, I know plenty of religious people, and even when they're not running for office, a lot of the stuff is about the image, the public image that they convey. And you might say that some of the beliefs are sincere and all that kind of stuff, but I'm just a little bit more cynical. I think a lot of these types of people are just trying to present a sort of holier than thou aura, and when it comes to politicians, they do that so they can get elected, but also they can get away with stuff more easily. It's like a way to deflect criticism, and Republicans are very notorious for doing that. And of course, liberals do that too. But it's definitely one of the main strong suits of the Republican or conservative right wing ideology and their methodology. And the film explores Bush's unwavering confidence, sometimes bordering on stubbornness, and his tendency to rely on instinct and personal certainty rather than lengthy policy analysis. That whole thing about following your gut, and I think shooting from your hip is another expression that a lot of these people might use. And finally, W examines the influence of advisors, whether it's Cheney, Powell, Rumsfeld, Rice, and Rove. They all are competing for influence, and it shows you how presidential decisions often emerge from a complex web of personalities rather than a single individual acting alone. And that's kind of a key thing to remember is that all of these decisions, whether they're good or bad, and usually they're bad when it comes to our political system, but they always require not just one person involved, but multiple people, like, and a population that's willing to tolerate those decisions to some degree. And ultimately, the movie asks an interesting question. What's the difference between strong conviction and overconfidence? That's one of the central tensions running throughout the entire story. And when it comes to Josh Brolin's performance, which I probably haven't talked about enough yet, but even critics who weren't especially fond of the movie generally agreed on one thing: Josh Brolin delivers an outstanding performance. Rather than settling for a simple impression of Bush's voice and his speech patterns, Brolin captures his body language, the humor, the awkward charm, and the distinctive mannerisms. Now, there aren't that many Bushisms in the movie, those kind of dumb things that George W. Bush would say sometimes, like misunderestimated, although I think that one actually is in the movie. But there are a bunch of Bushisms that just are not highlighted in this film, and that's actually more of a weakness. It's like a stronger weakness than you might think, because that was actually one of the defining aspects of the George W. Bush presidency. As weird as that probably sounds, but like all of these weird gaffes that he would constantly make, they were one of the things that are going to be most remembered about George W. Bush. Anyway, Brolin's portrayal feels less like an impersonation and more like a fully realized character. And it's one of those performances where you gradually stop thinking about the actor and simply accept the person on screen. Now, like I said, I at first was a little skeptical of, his ability to depict George W. Bush, but I kind of became more of a true believer, and many consider it the strongest element of the entire film, and I think I agree on that point. So, when W premiered, critics weren't quite sure what to make of it. The film currently holds a 58% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, a score of 56 on Metacritic, and around a 6.3 out of 10 on IMDb. Many reviewers, they went in expecting Oliver Stone to deliver a scathing political indictment. Instead, they found what Rotten Tomatoes called a surprisingly sympathetic portrayal that was fascinating in spots, but merely rudimentary as a whole. And you know what? This is one of those times where I kind of agree with Rotten Tomatoes. And some praised Stone for humanizing one of America's most controversial modern presidents without completely excusing his decisions, and others felt the movie did not dig deeply enough into Bush's presidency or provide much new historical insight. So, presidential historians might have criticized the film for emphasizing psychological speculation over historical precision, and some would find the cabinet portrayals overly exaggerated or perhaps just not depicted adequately enough. I think they kind of lacked context myself. Like, you get these moments where if you weren't familiar with the topics involved, if you didn't know the headlines, you would probably be lost about what they're talking about in the movie. So I think the movie could have done a better job of just providing context. And interestingly, the film ended up disappointing viewers on both sides of the political spectrum. Those wanting a harsh political attack found it too sympathetic, while those hoping for a more balanced biography, they thought it leaned too heavily into what could be called satire. Now, I didn't really see this movie as being too satirical. Oddly enough, I found it uh, a little bit more rooted in reality than a satire. Because satire, you tend to have exaggerated aspects. This movie, it seemed to be actually downplaying some of the crazy elements of the George W. Bush years. So commercially, W struggled, the movie, not the person. It was made for roughly $25 million. It earned about $29.5 million worldwide. So that's just a small profit. So while it technically recouped its production budget, it was not a major success. And if you want to have a successful movie, you really need to have a lot of dynamics going on at the same time. And I think one of the biggest problems here was that audiences were simply experiencing Bush fatigue. After 8 years of nonstop political coverage, there may not have been much appetite for another story centered on the outgoing president, especially during the final months of his administration. And keep in mind that at the time, George W. Bush was deeply unpopular, and he was in some ways sort of like the proto Trump. And you could look at a lot of different presidents and see some Trumpian moments, but I would say that George W. Bush, as well as Sarah Palin, were sort of the obvious proto Trumps of the pre Trump era. So looking back today, W has become something of a historical curiosity. Its greatest distinction is its timing. Few Hollywood films, if any other Hollywood films, have attempted a biographical portrait of a president before that presidency has even ended. And that immediacy gives the movie an unusual quality. Rather than looking back with years of historical perspective, it captures how George W. Bush was viewed during the closing chapter of his administration, and it kind of gives an idea of how he might have got to that place. Because of that, the film feels less like a definitive account of the Bush presidency and more like a psychological portrait of the man behind the office. So today, W is remembered primarily for Josh Brolin's nuanced and transformative performances, and as one of Oliver Stone's most restrained political films. Compared with the director's more overtly polemical works, it is surprisingly restrained, some might say tame, choosing to explore personality and motivation rather than simply argue about politics. So, whether you agree with its conclusions or not, it's an intriguing snapshot of a turbulent period in American history and a reminder that political biographies can be just as interested in the person as they are in the presidency and the policies. So, that's about it for this review. Thanks for listening. Feel free to comment and like and subscribe and share the episode, and I'll see you in the next episode.